The morning sun cut through the fog at Fort Bragg like a knife through butter, casting long shadows across the artillery training grounds. Captain James Mitchell stood alone beside his M1 155mm howitzer, running his calloused hands along the cold steel barrel with the tenderness of a father touching his newborn child. At 42 years old, he was considered ancient by military standards, a relic from the Great War who refused to fade into obscurity while younger men claimed glory on distant battlefields. James had been born in rural Kentucky, the son of a coal miner who died when he was 12. He learned early that survival meant innovation, that rules were often written by men who had never faced real danger. His mother worked 3 jobs to keep him in school, and when he enlisted at 17, he promised her he would make something of himself. 25 years later, he had kept that promise in ways neither of them could have imagined. The year was 1944, and the Pacific War raged with an intensity that made even hardened veterans wake up screaming. Young Lieutenant David Chun approached cautiously, his boots crunching on gravel. David was 23, fresh from West Point, his uniform still crisp and his idealism intact. He carried orders that would change both their lives forever. "Captain Mitchell, sir. Colonel Harrison wants to see you immediately. He says it's urgent." James didn't look up from his calculations, numbers and trajectories dancing across the worn notebook he carried everywhere. He knew what this was about. For 3 months, he had been developing something revolutionary, something that defied every conventional wisdom in the artillery manual. He called it the mirror-fire howitzer technique, a method of coordinating multiple artillery pieces to create a devastating cascade effect that could penetrate fortifications previously thought impregnable. "Tell the colonel I'll be there when I finish these calculations. Lives depend on precision, not punctuality." David shifted uncomfortably. The captain's reputation preceded him. Brilliant but stubborn, innovative but insubordinate, the kind of officer who won battles but made superiors nervous. He had been passed over for promotion 4 times, not because he lacked skill, but because he refused to conform. The technique James had developed was deceptively simple in concept but nightmarishly complex in execution. By positioning 3 howitzers at precisely calculated angles and firing in a specific sequence with millisecond timing, he could create a mirroring effect where the shock waves from each impact amplified the others. The result was destructive force that exceeded the sum of its parts, capable of shattering reinforced concrete that could withstand conventional bombardment. But the Army brass hated it. It required crews to operate outside standard protocols, demanded split-second coordination that left no room for error, and worst of all, it had been invented by a captain who hadn't bothered to request permission before testing it. 3 weeks ago, during a live-fire exercise, James had demonstrated the technique without authorization. The results were spectacular. A target bunker designed to withstand direct hits had been reduced to rubble in under 90 seconds. The next day, he was formally reprimanded. The week after that, the technique was officially banned. Too dangerous, they said. Too unpredictable. Impossible to standardize. James had stood at attention in Colonel Harrison's office and listened to the lecture about chain of command, about following orders, about the importance of doing things by the book. He had said nothing, but he also hadn't stopped refining the technique. Now, walking across the dusty parade ground toward the administration building, James felt the weight of his notebook in his breast pocket. Inside were calculations refined through countless sleepless nights, diagrams that represented months of obsessive work, the mathematical proof that his method could save thousands of American lives. The Pacific reports grew darker each week. Japanese fortifications on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa were proving nearly impossible to crack. Marines were dying by the hundreds trying to take positions that artillery couldn't touch. Colonel Harrison's office smelled of cigarette smoke and stale coffee. The colonel was 58, gray-haired and gray-souled, a bureaucrat in uniform who had spent more time behind a desk than in combat. He looked at James with the expression of a man forced to discipline a dog he secretly admired. "Mitchell, I'm going to be direct. General MacArthur's headquarters has received intelligence about Japanese fortifications in the Philippines. 9 reinforced positions protecting a strategic harbor. Our conventional artillery has failed repeatedly. We've lost 237 men trying to take them. The general is desperate. And despite my better judgment, despite every regulation you violated, your name came up. James remained silent, his face unreadable. Someone showed him footage of your unauthorized demonstration. He wants to know if your technique can break those fortifications. I told him you were unreliable, that the method was banned for good reason. Do you know what he said to me, Captain? No, sir. He said that wars aren't won by men who follow every rule. They're won by men who understand which rules to break. You have 72 hours to prove your technique works under combat conditions, or I'll have you court-martialed for insubordination. Dismissed. The briefing room felt like a tomb. James stood before a map of the Philippine harbor, 9 red circles marking the Japanese fortifications that had become a graveyard for American ambitions. 30 officers stared at him with expressions ranging from skepticism to open hostility. Major Robert Cunningham, a decorated veteran with a chest full of medals and a mind full of conventional tactics, crossed his arms and sneered. So this is the miracle worker, the cowboy who thinks he knows better than 300 years of artillery doctrine. James ignored him, focusing instead on the topographical details. Each fortification was a masterpiece of Japanese engineering. Reinforced concrete 6 feet thick, positioned on elevated terrain with overlapping fields of fire, supplied through underground tunnels that made them nearly impossible to starve out. Previous bombardments had barely scratched the surface. The technique requires 3 howitzer crews operating in perfect synchronization. The first shot creates a fracture point in the concrete. The second shot, fired 0.4 seconds later from a 47-degree offset angle, exploits that fracture. The third shot arrives 0.3 seconds after that, and the combined shock wave propagates through the structure like an earthquake. Major Cunningham stood up, his face red. This is fantasy. Artillery doesn't work like that. You're going to get men killed with your experimental nonsense. I've done the mathematics. I've tested it under controlled conditions. Controlled conditions aren't combat, Captain. In the field, timing falls apart. Crews panic. Equipment fails. Your mirror technique will collapse under real pressure, and American boys will die because some has-been captain wanted to play genius. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. Colonel Harrison raised his hand for silence, but the damage was done. James could see it in their faces. He was already convicted, not just of being wrong but of being dangerous, an arrogant outsider threatening the established order. That evening, James found Lieutenant Chun in the mess hall, eating alone. The young officer looked up nervously as James sat across from him. You don't have to associate with me, Lieutenant. I know what they're saying. David put down his fork. My grandfather came from China to build the railroads. They said Chinese workers were too weak, too unreliable. He helped build 3,000 miles of track. Sometimes the outsiders see what the insiders are too comfortable to notice. James felt something crack in his chest, a tiny fissure in the armor he'd built over decades of dismissal and isolation. I need 3 crews willing to train on the technique. Volunteers only. Tell them the truth. It's dangerous, it's banned, and if it fails, they'll be court-martialed alongside me. David nodded slowly. When do we start? Tonight. We have 72 hours to master something the Army thinks is impossible. And if we fail, those 9 fortifications stay standing, and more Marines die trying to take them the hard way. The weight of that reality settled over both men like a shroud. This wasn't about proving James right anymore. This was about 237 dead Americans, and the thousands more who would follow if nothing changed. The next 48 hours became a blur of calculations, drilling, and doubt. James worked his 3 volunteer crews until their hands bled and their ears rang from the constant thunder of practice rounds. Lieutenant Chun coordinated timing with a stopwatch, calling out fractions of seconds while sweat poured down his face despite the cold November air. The other 2 crew leaders, Sergeant Mike O'Brien from Boston and Corporal Tommy Washington from Alabama, pushed their men beyond exhaustion. But something miraculous was happening. The crews were synchronizing. What seemed impossible on paper was becoming muscle memory. O'Brien's team could load and fire in 4.2 seconds. Washington's crew had the angle calculations memorized. Chen's squad moved like a single organism, each man anticipating the next movement. On the morning of the third day, Colonel Harrison arrived at the practice range with General MacArthur's senior artillery advisor, Brigadier General Frank Morrison. Morrison was a legend, a man who had revolutionized artillery tactics at Verdun 26 years earlier. He watched in silence as James put his crews through one final demonstration. The target was a reinforced concrete bunker, identical in construction to the Japanese fortifications. James gave the signal. The first howitzer roared, its shell striking the upper left quadrant. 0.4 of a second later, the second piece fired from its offset position. 0.3 of a second after that, the third shell completed the sequence. The bunker didn't just crack. It exploded inward, the reinforced walls collapsing like a sand castle hit by a wave. The shock wave was so powerful that observers 100 yards away felt it in their chests. General Morrison walked to the rubble in silence, running his hand over the shattered concrete. When he turned back to James, his eyes were bright with something that looked almost like tears. "I told them you were crazy. I told Harrison to court-martial you and be done with it. But this changes everything. How soon can you deploy?" 48 hours, sir. We need time to ship the equipment and brief the crews on the terrain. You have 24. There's an assault planned on those fortifications in 3 days. If your technique fails, we lose another 200 men minimum. If it works, you might just change how we fight this entire war. James felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders like an iron yoke. 200 lives, maybe thousands, all depending on whether his band technique could perform under actual combat conditions against an enemy that would be firing back. If you're watching this story and hoping James succeeds, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, because what happens next in the Philippines will determine not just his fate, but the fate of an entire Marine division. The real test is about to begin. The Philippine heat hit them like a physical blow when they landed. James and his 3 crews were transported immediately to a forward position 3 miles from the Japanese fortifications. The stench of death hung in the air, bodies of Marines who had tried and failed to take those positions still visible in the distance. Lieutenant Chun vomited twice during the truck ride. Nobody blamed him. Major Cunningham was waiting at the command post, his face harder than the concrete they were about to destroy. He grabbed James by the arm with barely controlled fury. "There are 1,800 Marines waiting to advance the moment you crack those fortifications. If your technique fails, if you waste our ammunition on your experimental garbage, those men will have to go in without artillery support. Their blood will be on your hands, Mitchell." James pulled his arm free. "Then let me do my job." The howitzers were positioned at dawn. The mathematics that had seemed so elegant on paper became brutally complex in reality. The terrain was uneven, wind speeds were unpredictable, and the Japanese were launching sporadic mortar fire that kept everyone diving for cover. Sergeant O'Brien took shrapnel in his leg during setup but refused evacuation. Corporal Washington's rangefinder was damaged, forcing him to calculate angles by eye and instinct. James moved between positions, checking calculations 3 times, his hands shaking not from fear but from the crushing responsibility. He thought of his mother, dead now for 5 years, who had sacrificed everything so he could become something more than a coal miner's son. He thought of the 237 Americans already dead. He thought of the 1,800 waiting to advance. The first fortification loomed against the gray sky, its gun ports like dead eyes staring down at them. Japanese soldiers were visible moving behind the slits. They had no idea what was coming. "All crews ready," James shouted into the radio. "Fire on my mark. 3, 2, 1, execute." The first howitzer spoke with a voice like God's judgment. The shell struck perfectly, upper left quadrant exactly as planned. James counted in his head, 0.4 of a second feeling like an eternity. The second gun fired. The trajectory was beautiful, a perfect arc that intersected with the fracture point. 0.3 of a second. The third shell. The fortification exploded. Not cracked, not damaged. Exploded. The reinforced concrete that had withstood weeks of bombardment disintegrated in a cascade of dust and rubble. The Japanese gun fell silent. "Target 2, James called out, his voice steady now. every doubt burned away by the proof before his eyes. Adjust 3 degrees east. Fire sequence on my mark. By noon, 5 fortifications had been reduced to rubble. By 3 in the afternoon, 8 were gone. The 9th and final position was the largest, a command bunker built into a hillside with double-thick walls. "This is it," Lieutenant Chun said quietly. "Everything comes down to this." James nodded. "Then let's make it count. All crews, final sequence. Fire." The triple howitzer sequence fired with mechanical precision, each crew executing their role as if choreographed by fate itself. The shells arced through the humid Philippine air, 3 trajectories converging on the massive command bunker that had been the keystone of Japanese defensive strategy. The first impact sent visible cracks spiderwebbing across the reinforced facade. The second shell struck with surgical accuracy, exploiting those fractures. The third completed what physics and mathematics had promised. The bunker didn't just collapse. It seemed to fold in on itself, the double-thick walls that had been designed to withstand battleship bombardment surrendering to the cascading shock waves of the mirror fire technique. A massive dust cloud rose into the sky, and for 3 long seconds, the entire battlefield fell silent. Then the Marines erupted in cheers that could be heard miles away. 1,800 men who had been preparing to march into what they believed would be a slaughter suddenly faced an open path. Major Cunningham stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and something that might have been shame. He walked slowly to where James stood beside his howitzer, the captain's hands still trembling from adrenaline. "I was wrong about you, Mitchell. Completely wrong." James didn't respond with triumph or bitterness. He simply nodded, too exhausted for vindication. Lieutenant Chun appeared at his side, tears streaming down his dust-covered face. "We did it, sir. All 9 fortifications. 0 American casualties in the artillery operation." Sergeant O'Brien limped over, his leg hastily bandaged but his spirit unbroken. His Irish accent grew thicker with emotion. "My dad always said the best revenge is proving them wrong. You just saved thousands of lives, Captain. Thousands." Corporal Washington gathered his crew, and together they stood at attention, saluting James with a respect that transcended rank and regulation. The image burned itself into James's memory. Young men from every corner of America, unified by a technique that the Army had banned, that conventional wisdom had rejected, that desperate circumstances had finally allowed to prove itself. General Morrison arrived by jeep an hour later, accompanied by Colonel Harrison. The general surveyed the destroyed fortifications through binoculars, his weathered face unreadable. When he finally lowered them and turned to James, his voice carried across the position. "Captain Mitchell, effective immediately, the mirror fire howitzer technique is no longer banned. It's mandatory. Every artillery unit in the Pacific Theater will be trained in your method. Furthermore, you're hereby promoted to major and assigned to develop advanced artillery tactics for the remainder of the war." Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his earlier skepticism replaced by something approaching humility. "I owe you an apology, Mitchell. I was so focused on following procedure that I nearly cost us a war-winning advantage. The Army needs more officers willing to break the right rules at the right time." James looked at the rubble of the 9 fortifications, at the Marines now advancing safely through terrain that had been a death trap hours earlier, at his crews who had believed in him when nobody else would. The vindication felt less sweet than he had imagined during all those lonely nights of calculation and doubt. It simply felt necessary, like a debt finally paid. 3 years later, the war was over. Major James Mitchell stood in the Pentagon briefing room, now 45 years old with gray threading through his dark hair. Before him sat 24 young artillery officers, eager faces hungry for knowledge that had been purchased with blood and vindication. The walls were decorated with photographs from the Pacific Campaign, including an aerial shot of the 9 destroyed Japanese fortifications that had made his technique legendary. The mirror fire howitzer method had been used in 43 major engagements across the Pacific Theater. Military historians estimated it had saved between 15 and 20,000 American lives by making previously impregnable positions vulnerable. James had been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, promoted twice more, and offered a permanent position training the next generation of artillery officers. Lieutenant Colonel David Chun now served as his second-in-command, having proven himself a brilliant tactician in his own right. Sergeant O'Brien, despite his war wound, had stayed in the service and become one of the Army's most respected gunnery instructors. Corporal Washington had returned to Alabama, where he used his GI Bill benefits to become an engineer, applying the same mathematical precision to building bridges that he had once used to destroy fortifications. But the moment James treasured most had come 6 months after the Philippines operation. He had received a letter from a Marine corporal named Daniel Reeves, one of the 1,800 men who had advanced through the shattered fortifications that day. The letter was simple, written in rough handwriting on lined paper. Dear Major Mitchell, I don't know if you remember the day you broke those bunkers, but I was one of the Marines waiting to go in. My wife had just had our first baby, a daughter I'd never met. The doctors told us before I shipped out that my wife might not survive the birth, but she fought through it. When your artillery did its work, I realized I might actually live to meet my daughter. I made it home last month. Her name is Hope, and she's beautiful. I'm writing to say thank you for giving me the chance to be her father. Some rules are worth breaking when lives hang in the balance. James kept that letter in his desk drawer, reading it whenever the weight of command felt too heavy or the memory of those who hadn't made it home grew too sharp. The technique that had nearly ended his career had instead defined it, but more importantly, it had brought fathers home to daughters, husbands home to wives, sons home to mothers who had worked 3 jobs and sacrificed everything. As he dismissed his class that afternoon, James looked out the window at the Washington Monument rising against a peaceful sky. The war that had tested everything he believed about innovation, courage, and the cost of being right had ended, but its lessons endured. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it moved you, please hit that like button, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories of courage and innovation. What other untold stories from history would you like to hear? Let us know in the comments below. Sometimes the greatest victories come from those brave enough to challenge the impossible and prove that breaking the right rules can save thousands of lives.